The terror struck in midsummer 1916, a series of shark attacks that sparked hysteria at a New Jersey beach resort. As more people fell victim, panic swept the nation. Frightened citizens struck back, and thousands went hunting for sharks. As we go in search of history, we'll learn why, on the eve of World War I, the government found itself in a different kind of conflict, defending Americans against Shark Attack, 1916. For most of us, a day at the beach is a chance to relax and enjoy the surf. Over the years, Americans have been drawn to the sand and sea by the millions. Until a movie called Jaws made us wonder if it really was safe to go back in the water. But long before Hollywood, sharks were the subject of myths and legends. For thousands of years, mariners have told tales of horrifying attacks on fishermen and shipwrecked sailors. Some scholars even believe that the biblical story of Jonah and the whale may be based on an encounter with a great white shark.
People probably noticed sharks when they first started sailing, and since people were not always as ecologically correct as they are today, they would throw stuff overboard, and in the process of throwing stuff overboard, they would attract sharks. On the occasion where some person fell overboard, it was not beyond the possibilities that the person would be attacked by sharks. And it probably, we're talking probably within, 2,000 years, that people have been aware that some sharks, which were ship followers, were potentially dangerous.
But for most of history, little was known about sharks. They were part of a menagerie of mysterious sea monsters whose fanciful forms embellished maps and books. In some early prints, sharks were even portrayed with legs. It's only in the past century that scientists have begun to understand these creatures, their evolution, and their roles as the ocean's supreme predators.
Sharks are apex predators for the most part. There are about 350 different kinds of sharks, but the ones that we know best are large prey predators. When they can, they will take warm-blooded prey, and quite often they eat fishes or anything else they can catch.
And sharks can catch almost anything, including people. Attacks have occurred all around the world, including the southeastern and Gulf coasts of the United States and the coast of California. Those who are attacked face grave danger because sharks are designed to kill.
All shark teeth are replaceable in that it's kind of like an escalator for each row of teeth. The teeth move up from in back of the other ones to replace teeth that are lost. Some of them are serrated. The teeth of the white shark are very finely serrated, so much so that if you take a white shark tooth, a fresh one, and just pass it along your finger, it will cut you the way a razor blade does. It's that sharp.
Still, in spite of the shark's varied diet and formidable weapons, attacks on humans are relatively rare, and they are almost always isolated incidents. A series of attacks by a single shark, as in the movie Jaws, is almost unheard of. Until the late 19th century, the chances of an attack on a swimmer were even more slim than they are today. Americans frequently came to the shore to cool off, but few ever ventured into the sea. Nonetheless, the shark's notorious reputation was firmly established. In the early 1890s, there were reports of shark attacks along the east coast of the United States, but none was ever substantiated. They certainly didn't frighten a prominent New York shipowner named Herman Oelrichs, who was in the habit of swimming out to greet his ships as they approached the harbor. He scoffed at friends who warned him that the practice was dangerous and offered a $500 reward to anyone who could provide evidence of a shark attack on the Atlantic coast north of Cape Hatteras. No one ever came forward to claim it. By the first decades of the 20th century, ocean swimming was becoming more popular, and beaches were a fashionable place to spend the summer. Among the most popular resorts were the towns along the New Jersey shore. They were easy to get to, just a short train ride away from big cities like New York and Philadelphia.
And this leisure time was something that developed late in the Victorian period, so now everybody had free time. And those who could afford it, even a minimum amount, could come down. And on the other hand, there were some extremely wealthy people who built tremendous homes along the Jersey Shore, some of which still stand.
A lot would come to spend a day, and they'd probably eat someplace and go to the amusements, and a lot would do sunbathing, of course, on the beach. They'd spend all day there with the umbrellas and that sort of thing, get real sunburned. But it was cooler, and then there were different things along the boardwalk, concessions. You go in and out of those. And I remember as a teenager going down when they had the big bands there and dancing. It was lovely, just lovely.
People would promenade on the boardwalks, and they would wear long gowns and their finest outfits that would look a little out of place today because they looked so uncomfortable for the weather. But that was the atmosphere back then. In 1916, or even in the late 1800s, New Jersey really attracted everyone and anyone, including the riffraff, but mainly the politicians, the wealthy, even politicians to the extent of presidents. 7 presidents resided in Elberon and Long Branch. The summer White House was in Asbury Park in 1916.
Even before he became president, Woodrow Wilson maintained a summer home called Shadow Lawn on the Jersey Shore. His Treasury Secretary, William McAdoo, also had a summer home nearby. The New Jersey beaches attracted people and their money. It was in the interest of the town leaders to make sure the beach resorts were regarded as safe.
When swimming became a major source of business for the shore area, they had to watch out for the safety of the swimmers. And almost every beach had an area with poles and ropes within which the bathers should remain.
If anyone gave any thought to the risk of shark attacks, their fears were put to rest by scientists who published a research paper on sharks' behavior in April 1916. In it, they declared that there was no scientific proof that an unprovoked shark attack had ever occurred along the East Coast. In the report, Dr. Frederick Lucas, the director of the American Museum of Natural History, maintained that a shark's jaws were not even powerful enough to bite through a human leg bone. 3 months later, as a summer heat wave swept the eastern seaboard, people flocked to the beaches in record numbers. One of the thousands drawn to the shore was a young man named Charles Van Zandt. When he stepped off the train on July 1st in the seaside town of Beach Haven, he was looking for a little relaxation and a chance to beat the heat of Philadelphia. What happened to Charles Van Zandt would present the scientists with chilling evidence that their report had been wrong, and would throw the beaches of New Jersey into a panic. In 1916, Beach Haven was one of the most fashionable resort towns on the Jersey Shore. It was a popular summer destination for well-to-do residents of Philadelphia, who could reach it in only 2 hours by the new express train service. Saturday, July 1st, was another in a series of scorching days in a summer of heat waves. That afternoon, Charles Van Zandt, a 24-year-old stockbroker from Philadelphia, had just arrived in Beach Haven with his parents and 2 sisters. He hurried down to the beach to enjoy a stroll and a swim with his dog.
It was the custom back then for a young man of his age especially to jump into the ocean for a nice swim in the surf before dinner, and that's exactly what he did.
But Van Zandt's swim in the surf would soon turn into a life-and-death struggle. He was in shallow water, only 15 yards offshore, when suddenly he heard warning cries from people on the beach. From their vantage point, they could see a large fin heading straight for him. Van Zandt quickly made his way through the surf. But in just a few seconds, the shark struck. Van Sant's cries for help brought a quick response from a lifeguard who dashed into the water and dragged the injured man to shore. But Van Sant's thigh and leg were torn open, and he was losing blood too quickly.
His femoral artery was severed. It was actually spurting blood and into the air. They put him on the hotel manager's desk at the Ingleside, and he died within 2 hours.
One man was dead, and the killer was still at large. This was the first fatal shark attack ever recorded in the eastern United States. But initial press coverage was subdued. The Philadelphia papers, of course, took notice of the tragic death of a hometown boy. But in the New York Times, the incident was covered in a small article buried on page 28.
They did not even mention the word shark in the story. They said a fish attacked and killed a Philadelphia person.
Many people were skeptical about the attack. Some were unwilling to believe that a shark had been involved. Any concerns about safety on the beaches were quickly dispelled. The attack was called a fluke, a freak occurrence. There was nothing to worry about. But just 5 days later, it would happen again. This time, 45 miles up the coast, an area filled with Victorian houses and vacation cottages, and a grand hotel, the Essex and Sussex. Charles Bruder was a young Swiss immigrant working as a bellboy in the hotel. In his free time, he liked to head to the beach. On July 6th, he went swimming with some of his friends.
He swam beyond his friends, beyond the lifelines, and all of a sudden the lifeguards on shore thought that a red canoe had capsized because there was a wide strip of red water. They suddenly saw a man trying to keep afloat. They launched the lifeguard boat. They were yards away from him when he said, "A shark bit me, bit my legs off," and he could not keep afloat. They pulled him toward the boat, and they actually felt and reported that he was lighter than they expected. His reduced weight apparently was secondary to the fact that both of his legs were missing below the knees.
The lifeguards rowed as quickly as they could, but Bruder died in the bottom of their boat before they could reach the shore. This time, the public reaction was different. Panic began to set in. The headlines were more frightening, and in the New York Times, this story of the second death was front-page news.
My grandfather told us about it as soon as we got there because he wanted to give us every precaution. He wasn't at all sure that we should even go to the beach, but my parents decided that we would go down and see what was going on, and we did. But we were never allowed to go in the water unless we were with a parent, an adult.
What made matters sensationally worse was the fact that Woodrow Wilson had his Secretary of the Treasury staying at the hotel where this bellboy was staying at that exact time.
Over the next few days, as news of the second attack began to spread, beachgoers fled in terror. Merchants and politicians called for immediate action. At stake were lives and millions of dollars in lost revenue. Some shore towns promptly set up armed patrols. A few also installed anti-shark nets of steel mesh to protect bathers, or at least make them feel safer.
When the first shark attacked a swimmer, I think the reaction was, well, that was an unfortunate accident, and nobody got overly excited about it north or south of where the event took place. But as more shark attacks took place, the lifeguards were more on the alert. People were forewarned that there are sharks along the coast.
I think that people upon the first or second of the attacks began to get, in a crowd sense, hysterical, and began to believe that the waters were infested with man-eating sharks, and there were a lot of attempts made to hunt for them, to shoot them, to blow them up, to somehow rid the water of sharks. And every expert was interviewed on what are we supposed to do about this.
As officials tried to calm the public, advertisements in local papers invited people to return to the beaches, reassuring them that it was still safe to go back in the water. But bathers remained on edge. In one case, beachgoers ignored a swimmer's cries for help, fearing that she was struggling with a shark. In fact, she was only suffering from a cramp. She drowned while they watched. Many people turned from the beaches to waters that were guaranteed to be shark-free. Local pools and even fountains provided safe havens for swimmers. A postcard mailed from Asbury Park on July 8th sums up the reaction.
The beach is patrolled by boats since a scare of a shark biting off the legs of a man the other morning. Since then, a great many bathers are rather scarce.
In spite of the precautions and reassurances, summer seemed to have ended early in the beach resorts of the Jersey Shore. No one was venturing into the sea. In the aftermath of 2 fatal shark attacks, the beaches of the Jersey Shore were beginning to look deserted. But inland, away from the sea, people were still heading into the water. After all, the rivers and streams were free of sharks, weren't they? One place that still seemed safe for swimmers was the quiet little town of Matawan, 11 miles from the ocean. In 1916, Matawan was far removed from the fashionable beach resorts of Spring Lake and Beach Haven, and it had so far escaped the hysteria sparked by the shark attacks at those shore towns.
Matawan was like many small towns in Jersey, and it had its main street with the stores. It's sort of a village. It had 2 factories, and the people that lived in town were all very friendly, and many of them were related. And neighbors always helped each other, so it was a nice place to be.
Matawan Creek is a muddy tidal river that meanders down to the sea. On the morning of July 12th, nearly a week after the second shark attack, a retired fishing captain named Thomas Cottrell was walking across the trolley drawbridge on the outskirts of town. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of something moving upriver through the creek. He could hardly believe his eyes, but looking closer, he was certain he knew what it was. A large gray shark, perhaps 8 feet long. Cottrell hurried back to town to alert his neighbors, but no one bothered to check out his story, much less do anything. A shark in Matawan Creek?
No one believed him. Even after the first 2 attacks, no one believed that a shark could actually enter the creek and make its way up toward that narrow body, inland body of water.
Meanwhile, as the day grew hotter, 11-year-old Lester Stillwell and 4 of his friends headed out to their favorite section of Matawan Creek. The water was muddy, but it was cool, and they swam here nearly every day. That day, they were playing in a shallow part of the creek when one of them felt something brush up against his leg. He would later say it felt like sandpaper. Suddenly, several of the boys saw a fin racing through the water toward Lester. Then they watched in horror, helpless, as something seized their friend and dragged him under. Terrified, the boys scrambled from the water and raced to town. Lester's fate was unknown. Alerted by the boys, rescuers rushed to the creek. One of the first to arrive was Stanley Fisher, a 24-year-old tailor.
Stanley said he was going down to see if he could help his friend, and he left my husband in charge, who was about 7 years old at that time, but he never came back. Stanley Fisher never came back.
Stanley dove in where the boys said their friend had gone down and came up with the partially dismembered body of Lester Stilwell. But as he made his way to shore, he too was attacked. Stanley Fisher died on the operating table, the fourth victim of the shark attacks. Local residents were stunned. Nothing like this had ever happened here before.
The whole town was upset, you know, naturally. And then it was someone they knew, you know, local boy, and then the other one who went. So naturally, they were very upset about it. So we went down where it had happened, and everyone was excited about it in the town. I can still see it vividly, us riding down to the creek and waiting to get there, you know, and then all these people walking alongside of the cars, and you're easing your way along, you know, and wondering, you know, what you're going to see. Well, you didn't see anything, only the water, you know.
There was nothing to see because the shark had moved, but only a few hundred yards downstream, where another group of boys was playing in the wrong place at the wrong time. When word reached them about the attacks on Stilwell and Fisher, they began clambering out of the creek. But as the last boy, 12-year-old Joseph Dunn, was climbing the ladder to shore, he was struck from behind. Joseph was lucky. He lost his leg to the shark, but not his life. Meanwhile, the entire town of Matawan quickly mobilized and launched a massive counterattack. But the enemy would prove elusive. They used every weapon at their disposal fighting this unfamiliar adversary. Local hardware stores quickly sold every bullet and every stick of dynamite. Crowds of spectators gathered along the banks of Matawan Creek to watch as preparations were made to blast the waterway. The shark attacks were becoming a very big story. The press had a field day, taking advantage of every photo opportunity and even creating a few. But despite the best efforts of the courageous citizens of Matawan, the shark got away. Today, the creek is much as it was more than 80 years ago. It still draws those who seek its tranquility or its tragic past.
It's extraordinary that in a tidal creek no more than 40 feet wide, brackish, murky, high tides and low tides, that a shark capable of doing what it did actually occurred at this very spot. It's a peaceful spot in that it's quiet, there's a lot of solitude here, but you can still feel the tragedy, the awe of the attacks, and you can almost see all the panicked townspeople coming down and the awe on their faces to find that two of their citizens were brutally attacked, and then to find that another boy was maimed just 400 feet away. And women, you can see women, the mothers running up and down the creek yelling to have their other children jump out of the water. The shark, a shark. A shark got Lester, a shark got Stanley.
The two shark attacks on the New Jersey shore had been thought of as isolated incidents. But with 3 more in Matawan Creek, the situation was getting out of control.
There had been infrequent attacks, one every 2 years, one every 5 years, one every 20 years, and suddenly bang, 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 there were 5 attacks in a 10-day period. And this suddenly made everybody start thinking about sharks all of a sudden in a very different way.
Reaction in the press was beginning to escalate. The headlines were huge, the coverage more sensational. And no wonder, the grisly attacks made for gripping stories. As news of the attack spread, out-of-town press joined the fray and descended upon Matawan.
We had many newspapers and reporters coming, looking, you know, to see what the town was like and look for this shark. Not very often do you have sharks coming up a small creek, killing people. to think of something like that happening in a small town that had been quiet and nothing ever, happened like that before. And all of a sudden, it was very upsetting.
After the Mattawan attacks, obviously, sharks killing people in New Jersey was the story that was eclipsing all national news. World War I was secondary. Even the London Times was talking about man-eating sharks invading the shores of the U.S.
In 1916, there was no shortage of big news stories. The war in Europe was entering its third year. 1 million Allied and German troops were fighting to a bloody stalemate at the Battle of Verdun. The Germans were conducting unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, and their U-boats were off the coast of the United States, threatening commercial vessels and creating havoc in busy shipping lanes. At the same time, Pancho Villa was raiding American towns in South Texas. The U.S. government sent troops under General Pershing to chase him back into Mexico. But for a few weeks, it was the New Jersey man-eater that grabbed the headlines. Panic quickly swept the country, and sharks became the focus of national attention. There were wild rumors, like the bizarre story that sharks were venomous. Everyone was worried about the danger of attack. Sharks were even featured in editorial cartoons. They were the metaphor of the moment, and this was the biggest story of the summer. Even President Woodrow Wilson became involved. New Jersey was his home state, and the summer White House was just a few minutes from where the second shark attack took place. Wilson called his cabinet into an emergency meeting and demanded action. At his side was Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo, another summer resident of New Jersey.
After the Mattawan attack, all national focus was on the Jersey Shore. You had people losing their lives. You had a quickly declining Jersey Shore economy. And Woodrow Wilson, as a former New Jersey governor, was going to do everything he could, call the cabinet meeting to send a federal agent to New Jersey, and got the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Coast Guard involved to do everything they could to catch the shark, to catch all sharks, and to safeguard everyone from possible attacks.
Many Jersey Shore communities offered a bounty for anyone who could kill the man-eating shark, or sharks. Hundreds of fishermen set out to collect the rewards. Up and down the entire mid-Atlantic coast, it was open season on sharks. Everybody with a boat, it seemed, went shark hunting. They killed thousands of sharks using guns, harpoons, even small cannons.
Well, they did almost everything they could think of to attempt to slow this down. They were obviously afraid that this was the end of the world, that Mattawan Creek or the whole Jersey coast was going to be shark infested, and that nobody would be safe in the water again.
On July 14th, one of the shark hunters, a New Yorker named Michael Schleiser, was fishing in Raritan Bay, just 4 miles northwest of the mouth of Mattawan Creek. He caught a shark known to be a man-eater, a great white. When the shark's stomach was opened, it contained 15 pounds of human remains in various states of decay, including an 11-inch fragment assumed to be Charles Bruder's shin bone. This was surely the killer they'd been looking for.
Those remains in that great white caught in Raritan Bay were positively identified as human by the director of the American Museum of Natural History, Frederick Lucas.
Lucas was the scientist who had declared just a month earlier that sharks were incapable of biting through a human leg. Now he was forced to admit that the report had been wrong.
Schleiser, a taxidermist by trade, within 24 hours, he had that stuffed and prepared and put it on display at the Bronx Home News newspaper office. Thousands of people lined up to see the Jersey man-eater. Many people did not know what a shark looked like at that time. Some people were claiming that it was actually a porpoise because a shark's jaws were actually supposed to be on its side and not in the front of its mouth.
Of course, by that time, there were some pictures of sharks And so I became aware of what a shark looked like, but I didn't really have an understanding of the tremendous dimensions of a shark. And that was kind of scary when I realized how large they were.
They had caught a killer, but was a single shark responsible for all of the attacks? Some experts believe there had to be more than one man-eater.
I'm not really convinced that they had caught the killer shark, nor am I convinced from reading many of the contemporaneous reports that the bones in this shark had anything at all to do with any of the attacks.
Whether or not the killer shark had been eliminated, there were no more attacks off the New Jersey coast that summer. But for merchants and hotel owners, it was already too late. They had lost millions of dollars in summer revenues and the goodwill and confidence of vacationers.
The summer was virtually lost. There were, believe it or not, 30 mayors from Jersey Shore who were trying to get to the director of the American Museum of Natural History to say, this was not a shark-perpetrated incident. There are no real threats by sharks toward people swimming in the water. He obviously couldn't abide by that. Even in August of 1916, this story was attempted to be pushed to the back reaches of people's consciousness. People tried to forget about it immediately. 1917, no one spoke about shark attacks. So years and years had passed by, and people, why would they want to sensationalize or advertise the fact that there were 5 attacks in 11 days on the Jersey Shore?
The hunt was over. Swimmers gradually returned to the beaches. The New Jersey shark attacks would soon be forgotten. But questions remained. Why had they occurred in the first place? What forces drew man-eating sharks to the Jersey Shore? Why did man-eating sharks suddenly begin attacking the citizens of New Jersey in 1916, apparently for the first time ever in these waters? That summer, with its record-high temperatures, there were certainly more people at the beaches, but there were also reliable reports of increased numbers of sharks farther offshore. Sailors and fishermen said they had sighted schools of sharks in places where they had never seen any before. What drew the sharks to the Jersey Shore? There was no shortage of explanations offered by New Jersey residents and fishermen, but most of them were based on guesswork, not science. One theory held that sea battles off Europe had driven sharks westward toward the northeastern shores of the United States. Others said that sharks in the North Atlantic had acquired a taste for human flesh from the 15,000 sailors who had died at sea since the beginning of the war. But there was no increase in shark attacks elsewhere on the eastern seaboard, only in New Jersey. A few scientists noted a temporary change in the Gulf Stream which might have accounted for increased numbers of sharks in new areas. But perhaps there was a simpler explanation. With more people in the water, the sharks may simply have had more targets that summer.
And in July of 1916, there was a heat wave that spread from North Carolina all the way to Maine. And therefore, there were even more people in the water than would normally have been in the water during the month of July 1916. Now, a lot of people in the water will attract sharks. The mechanics of a shark attack, or the stimulation for a shark attack, has never been really known. We don't know whether sharks are hungry, whether they're territorial, whether they feel threatened, whether they are just examining this object, which happens to consist of feet. Remember that sharks have no way of testing something except by biting it. And the shark probably doesn't think, I'm just going to nibble on this thing and see if it's tasty, and then if it is, the shark goes in and bites it and says, oh, well, not edible, swims away. But deciding something is not edible could result in the death of that non-edible creature.
Whatever caused the attacks in 1916, the big question that remained was, could it happen again? Could man-eating sharks return to invade New Jersey's beaches and rivers and terrorize swimmers? It would take nearly half a century to answer that question. In 1960, the sharks came back to the Jersey Shore. John Brodeur was visiting his fiancée in Seagirt, New Jersey that summer. He was a newcomer to the Jersey Shore, unaware of what had happened there in 1916.
I didn't know anything about those attacks. Never heard of them. Never heard of shark attacks in New Jersey. I enjoyed the ocean. I was 24 years old, and I came down weekends during that summer. I saw a wave, and I thought to myself, gee, I should have taken that wave. It looked good, and I turned around and watched the wave go into to the shore. And as I turned back, I saw to the right some big black object in the wave, and I said to myself, well, it's either a person or a log in the wave. And as soon as I planted my foot firmly in the sand, I was hit with such tremendous force that I can't even equate it to anything. It was so strong. I looked down, and the water turned red almost instantly, and you could see bits of flesh floating up toward the surface. I screamed, but no words were coming out. It was the blood was draining that fast out of me.
Brodeur was rushed to the hospital, where emergency surgery was performed on his leg, which had been nearly severed. The attending doctor said it appeared to be guillotined. In the end, Brodeur's leg had to be amputated. Once again, patrols were called out to guard the beaches. This time, men flew in helicopters and carried machine guns. The U.S. Navy provided one of its blimps, which flew up and down the coast looking for the shark. The old fears resurfaced. People who recalled the events of 1916 shared their memories of that summer and braced themselves for the hysteria. But this time, only one more attack occurred, and no one was killed. The shark was never caught. But the summer was saved, and the panic of 1916 was once again forgotten. Even John Brodeur was able to put the fear and the trauma behind him.
I go in, I go body surfing. I look around, but I do go in. I'm not going to let one incident prevent me from enjoying the ocean. I do enjoy it.
Beachgoers tend to share Brodeur's attitude. In all likelihood, the fictional book and movie Jaws frightened more people out of the ocean than real shark attacks ever did. Most people still believe it won't happen to them.
I don't think they realize there are sharks out there because they probably feel the same way I did back in 1960. There has been no recorded attacks that I know of since 1960, since my attack. But they're out there.
Are the sharks still out there? Are there more man-eaters lurking just below the waves? Shark fisherman Bruce Miller can't predict another shark attack, but he does know there are plenty of sharks. As the captain of the fishing boat Mirage out of Point Pleasant, New Jersey, he heads to sea every weekend looking for them. Captain Miller knows what beachgoers may not want to hear. There are lots of sharks out there, big ones, swimming just off our shores.
I started shark fishing back in 1974, 73 in that area. When I go out, I see mako sharks, tiger sharks, a lot of blue sharks, dusky sharks, sandbar sharks, hammerheads. I've caught, in the years I've been shark fishing, I guess over 1,000. Could be a little bit less, a little bit more.
Come to the boat! He's jumping in the boat! Oh my God!
The size of most of the sharks off Jersey are anywhere from 30 pounds to a couple thousand if you run into a white shark. A white shark could go 15, 14 foot long. Should people be worried? I wouldn't say they should be worried. There's not really a lot of sharks that come into the beach, but there have been shark sightings, and there are a lot of sharks offshore. You can find them.
But for those who can recall the events of 1916, sharks are still something to worry about.
I really never forgot about those sharks, because when I was in Florida years later, on a friend's boat in the Everglades and swimming from their boat in the Everglades and having my hostess say, "There are sharks in this water," I scampered right back up the ladder. I wasn't going to swim in the Everglades with sharks. So it really apparently made an impression on me that I really never forgot.
Over the past 80 years, there have been hundreds of shark attacks in the United States, occurring with some regularity off the Carolinas and Florida, as well as in the Gulf of Mexico. Great whites attack surfers off California. But not since 1916 has the United States seen so many attacks in one area over a period of less than 2 weeks.
The sequence of attacks, the viciousness, the frequency, the scientific irony involved, it's unparalleled, really. I doubt we'll see it again, but you never know.
I don't think that there's going to be, I mean, I could be proven wrong. I mean, tomorrow, sharks could cruise the beaches of New Jersey or Coney Island or Florida or somewhere else and start eating people by the dozen. It's possible, but not the slightest bit probable.
Others might disagree. With so many swimmers and so many sharks in the water, close encounters seem inevitable. But could an invasion of man-eaters happen again, as it did in 1916? That question still lingers as we go in search of history.